Zidan, nismi sam nedosta si verada galova. Droa serca kolodano vamo slavova. Zadak mi hoce, vede trebi kvelat snimda salovca. Zadak mi hoce, vede trebi kvelat snimda salovca.
Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. I'm Sopo.
And I'm Brian.
Today we have a very special guest, Levan Asabashvili, who will discuss Soviet Georgian housing policy, which I have been wanting to have for this podcast for our audience, because I think it's one of the best things about Soviet Georgia and one of the most interesting parts. So I'm very, very excited to have Levan today. Levan, can you introduce yourself to us?
Hello, thank you for inviting me here on the podcast. I'm Levan Asabashvili. I am architect and I am doing my PhD research in the Georgian Technical University. I'm studying basically Soviet architecture, later period of Soviet architecture.
Tell us, maybe set the stage for how did Soviet housing policy develop? What were the challenges beforehand?
Before the Soviet Union in Georgia and in the rest of the area which later became Soviet Union, the housing problem was very harsh. There was no housing provision. The communal housing which was built, it was private, and then it was rented. Mainly it was a rented house, and then the rest of the housing stock was private houses. Often it was self-built. When the land is occupied by the settlers, it is called Nakhaloga, and there is also a district in Tbilisi which is called Nakhaloga, which was built in this way. So this was a situation, and generally the housing condition was very poor. So after the Soviet rule was established in Georgia, one of the main priorities was to provide decent housing for the workers. These policies, of course, they changed, as well as the approaches and as well as the architecture of this housing. So today we can discuss this whole process and the stages and how it went through. We can divide housing architecture in three main stages. It is the early period, constructivist period, then the Stalinist period, and then the period after Stalin. And accordingly, the housing policies we are changing in these three stages. Of course, there are inside these periods also there are some nuances that we can also discuss today. But this is the main characterization of this housing architecture and policies.
When I was reading the history of the Communist Party of Georgia, they talked about the conditions in mining towns where workers slept in the mines during the winter before, of course, Sovietization, and then slept outside during the summer. And that was pretty much their housing for a long time. And so a lot of I would say, like, is it comparable before Sovietization, where the sort of the shacks, the settlements they had was kind of like how like Brazil's favelas, or, these kinds of, we see a lot of like Latin American countries have these, self-made houses. Was it similar to that?
Of course, the mining towns, the same situation, maybe worse, because in Tbilisi it was probably more appropriate the materials or more available the land, and the infrastructure, city infrastructure in general. But in the mining towns. In this period, it was the industrialization period start when it started, and of course it was more like harder to for the workers to find shelter. So that's why it was probably there were some provided some shelter for them, but of course not enough and not like normal quality for living. After the Soviet rule was established, we also saw the massive housing construction in these mining towns like Chiatura or Tbilisi, or industrial towns like Rustavi. It was established a new town, but anyway, while Chiatura and Tbilisi are older, they developed before the Soviet Union.
Great. So maybe we can start with the first phase, the constructivist.
After the establishment of Soviet rule in Georgia, as I said, one of the main priorities was to provide workers with adequate housing. There was no possibilities to build directly because there were economic problems. The first step was to nationalize the existing housing stock, mainly in the city center, because in the city center was a place for the collective housing, which was before it was privately owned, rented out, or just privately owned by these wealthy families. After this expropriation, these houses were subdivided and given to the workers and to the people who were in need of housing. So even today, what we have in the city center, historic center, it is this social composition. It has changed after the massive housing building of late Soviet period, but mainly we have the remnant of this picture of social composition of these neighborhoods. These people who are still living in the city center, they got these houses as a result of this expropriation. Of course, they enlarged their houses, their dwellings after the massive housing production, but mainly it's this picture that we have today. Yeah. After this, or in parallel with this, there were first experimental buildings which were built as a collective housing, and I choose these two examples from 1928 and 1932. Which is the first one is a housing for the tramway workers, and this is a first attempt to try to conceptualize the microrayon, or this not only one building but the group of buildings, or like a first attempt to make some kind of microrayon out of these buildings. And architecture of these buildings, of this building was, even though it was constructed in this constructivist period, which was mainly focused on the rationalist architecture, but in peripheries, often they tried to make architecture with some kind of local or national symbols or decorations. So this first example is this kind of approach. The second example is it is called the House of Specialists. This is also later the second kind of attempt of making a small housing complex or microrayon both complexes are standing today. They are existing today. The first one is located on the Aghmashenebeli Avenue near the Dinamo Stadium, football stadium, and another one, this specialist house, which is from 1932, is located on the Shartava Street, right in front of the municipality building. The architecture of these specialist houses was more rationalist and more aligned to these constructivist ideas of early modernism. Uh, Here on the picture, we can see like very specific constructivist balconies and rationalist clean facade of the building. This is not one building, but it's also, as I said, several buildings situated together, and this is an attempt of creating some kind of microrayon, which was this kind of ideas were abandoned in the Stalinist period because Stalinist architecture was had different aims and different special arrangement. But after the Stalinist period, the architects returned to the constructivist ideas, tried to learn from the earlier experiments. The Stalinist period is also, we can divide architecture of housing architecture and generally architecture of Stalinist period uh, before the World War II and after the World War. So this example is from the late 30s. Aims of Stalinist architecture were the same before the World War and after it. Only after the World War, of course, building wider scale uh, than before the war. And the architecture of these houses was quite different than in the earlier period. And on the urban scale, this house it was more like classical approach, and with housing buildings, new axes in the town were created, and it was more creating streets and avenues and not spreading buildings like in earlier period, as I showed in the microrayons. The architecture was more classicist, often with so-called national features, and these houses were given more to the elite, Soviet elite, party nomenclature, high military ranks, scientists, academics, people from culture, prominent people from culture. It was more exclusive. Of course, there were cases when houses were given to the workers, but these workers were also somehow outstanding people because there were also socialist competitions inside the production places and or in agrarian kind of places or in academic spaces. What I try to say is that the working people were also somehow outstanding or outstanding in their fields who got these houses. On the parallel, of course, there was a different kind of building production going on, and in Stalinist period, this policy was to support private housing building with cheaper materials. The materials were subsidized, like elementary materials like brick or wood, like covering materials, uh, and uh, uh, and for example, we have this kind of examples in the district of Sabotalo. There are buildings from late 30s during the war period or even after the war period that were built in this kind of manner, and these buildings were more accessible to the working people, uh, and also there was a subsidies on land. The areas were designated and given to the collectives, and then collectives distributed to the workers, and this kind of private houses or even some small-scale collective houses were built in this way. So this was two main trends of housing production in the Stalinist period. After the war, of course, the scale of building industry grew massively, and what we have today in the city is the Stalinist housing we have in from this period after the war period, and also after the war, the Stalinist housing buildings became more accessible for the workers. For example, we have some examples in Isani, for example, or in Didube, which were built in this period, and built by the institutions or by some production organizations and distributed to the workers of these organizations. There were also some examples of communal buildings, so-called communalkas in the Stalinist buildings, and these kind of dwellings were also accessible to the more ordinary people. And it was distributed in this way that there was a house or the apartment, and this apartment was divided uh, to different families or to different individuals, and they had shared amenities like kitchen or bathroom, etc. But this thing did not continue. This was more before the World War, and after that, such kind of dwellings became private dwellings, and some of the people were moved to the new buildings after the Khrushchev period, massive housing construction. So now it is only visible on architecture on some of the Stalinist buildings that initially they were built as a communalkas.
So I know now that the Stalinist buildings are the most desired because they're huge, usually beautifully made. And when I have seen, I also had not seen a lot of the Stalinist apartments. When I have seen them, I think they're like incredible, right? Like one of the best apartment buildings or apartments I've seen in Tbilisi. Is that true for generally now? Like it's in high demand and it's considered one of the highest quality in all of Soviet Union.
Yes, sure, because buildings were built with more higher they were of higher quality. The building techniques or the space of the apartments or the height of the ceilings, for example, or the materials for the building, it was a higher quality, of course. Uh, and the main critique after de-Stalinization was that a lot of resources were spent on the houses. Quality was high, but the quantity was small. So this was main critique, and also this critique was extended to the excessive decoration of these Stalinist buildings on the facades and everything. Until today, they are the most desirable places, and until today, the former Soviet or the descendants of the Soviet elite are living in this kind of houses. For example, in the Vake district, we have many such examples, and in other places, it is most demanded, and still descendants of the Soviet elite who became also post-Soviet elites. They are living in these buildings.
For the Stalin era Soviet architecture and housing that you're talking about, how did the Soviet Georgian housing projects in this period differ from the way they were built in other parts of the Soviet Union?
Basically, the approach was the same. Uh, Maybe they differ on the kind of uh, very elementary materials. For example, I don't know the kind of wood or kind of brick or something else or kind of concrete, but the approach was the same, that they were built on the with a labor intensive. They were more labor intensive, not industrialized production. They were mainly built with brick, which is also until today it is a high quality material. Mm, yeah, which is important is that what is important is that they were also labor intensive, but this was true in Soviet Georgia and in other republics, and that's why the outcome was high quality. Quantity was not so, I mean, high. And yeah, of course, the projects themselves were higher quality, in a way that the dwellings that were provided were more spacious, more like higher ceiling, etc. Like the larger space, uh, and that's why, yes.
One of the first places I rented in Tbilisi, a formal brothel that was converted into apartments. So it was like, even then you could walk down the inside the kind of hallway, and each door was like a high door with numbers on it, like a brothel room. So I think that was during the constructivist period. That was probably, although brothels were changed into these communal housing.
Yes, yes. After expropriation, these places became the housing for the workers. Yeah, and these houses were also communalkas, because they didn't, of course, they didn't provide individual kitchens or individual bathrooms. They were subdivided places for the families, and then they had communal amenities. This was a main kind of typology, and this changed after they started massive production of housing, and people were removed there. A lot of people were removed from the city center, which were settled in this way after expropriation. So after this, who stayed in these buildings, they already had the chance to enlarge their houses, like add some more rooms and arrange some amenities like kitchens and bathrooms inside the apartments. So probably that's why also that is one of the reasons of the physical condition of this housing stock today, because they were all changed and adapted in this way, uh, and um, uh, and probably not done correctly, like from the engineering viewpoint, and that's why they have these physical problems also today.
Okay, so moving from Stalinism, which focused a lot on facades, like you said, quality was high, but the quantity was smaller. What happens afterwards?
Yes, after Stalinism, as you know, there was a big criticism of and this process of de-Stalinization, what we know in every field, no, and also this was in architecture, and the main critique, as I said, was the thing that the materials were used inappropriately, not economically. The need was much higher, and the supply was low. So they started thinking how to change this. In this kind of conflict is shown in this film, which is called in Georgian film, which is called Abezara. I had a clip also of this, but also anyone can find in the YouTube. This it is about architect who is working in the studio, state architecture studio, and the chief of the studio is supporting this more traditional Stalinist architecture. And then there is a show this scene that young architect comes in and shows this massive produced so-called Khrushchevka, and then there is a conflict between them, and he states that he he will never allow this kind of architecture in his studio. So it's also shown in the film, so you can also find and see it. It's interesting. So how they started thinking about it, was it the main aim was industrialization of the building industry, building process. But there were some steps also some periods also in this later period of housing architecture. And first they just started building with bricks again, as the Stalinist buildings were built, but without decoration. And the planning and architecture of the buildings and dwellings were more economical. So they started just building with the same materials, labor-intensive building process, with many workers involved in the building process, and also more time-consuming process. And yeah, the planning was more economical, smaller dwellings. We have good examples of such houses in Varketili. Right, it was the first one of the first microrayons also built in Tbilisi, and this microrayon is still standing, even though some of the buildings are already physically really damaged, and now the municipality has a program of changing these buildings with new ones, but still it's still visible. And yes, and what is also important is that also urban planning approaches changed in this period, and they started thinking. They went to the constructivist ideas of microrayon. Microrayon is a complex of housing blocks with main communal amenities included, like schools, kindergarten, or some shops, and this kind of everyday needs. And this concept was started in the earlier period in the 20s, and it was like a larger, of course, it was a larger trend in Western Europe. Were also architects and thinkers, planners who were elaborating with these ideas, and also Soviet constructivists. Among them, were one of the first to kind of experiment with these ideas. In the Stalinist period, these ideas were put aside, and this different approach was implemented. But after the Stalinist period, yeah, planners and architects went back to these ideas, which started in the 20s, but also in parallel, in Western Europe, it also developed somehow. For example, I mean, Soviet architects were specially sent to, for example, France to study in the 60s, to study the massive production of housing and the planning, and they were studying the publications and everything. So this was a symbiosis and synthesis of these earlier Soviet avant-garde ideas, and also the Western examples which developed during the Stalin's period here. And they were actively trying to study from these examples, and to adapt to the socialist planning principles, and socialist planning aims. So yes, the first thing was this labor intensive, the same materials, but economical planning, but also in parallel the experimental building methods we are also implemented as a result of this exchange with the Western examples and like local experiments also. And they also already started some industrialization of the building process. And for example, the panel buildings, large parts of the buildings were made in the factories and assembled on the place. And this was much more economical, much more time-saving method of production. And also we have one of the first panel buildings, which is very interesting also from the early 60s, in the same microrayon which I mentioned in Varketili. So we have on one place, we have these brick buildings, which we are like started earlier, and then these experimental ones from very early periods, and now they're also physically damaged and also kind of ready for demolition, which is also pity too, because it's a very important kind of historical stage of the architecture of Tbilisi, for example. And after this, these techniques were developed also, and the new techniques introduced not only panel buildings, but there were different other methods of building with so-called large blocks, which is not panel, but it's like a blocks, massive blocks, but larger, like one story. It could be one height of one story, and different kind of engineering methods, and this proliferated in different ways, and it was parallel process that we had three or four main construction methods by which the massive housing was built in this period. And of course, scale of quantity of building much larger, by which like new microrayons or new districts were built, which we have also today, and as a main housing stock of the city. In the later period, where the Soviet economy also became higher technological and more scientific, and so-called white-collar working places proliferated, like, I don't know, scientific institutions, academies, some government organizations, many such kind of things. And labor-intensive production diminished. The production became automatized. Balance between the workers in the production and the white-collar workers changed in comparison to the, for example, Stalinist period. And together with the provision of this housing, it created the middle class in the Soviet Union. This middle class embraced demands of for the democratization, for example, which were which started also in the late period of the Soviet Union. Democratization, this bourgeois ideology, like a liberal ideology today, and the housing stock played, I think, a very important role in this, in the creation of the middle class in Soviet Georgia and in the rest of the Soviet Union. So it's interesting today also that, for example, the processes which are going on today, if we perceive it as a kind of revolt of the middle class, or the roots of this class, or of this ideology can be found in the later period of the Soviet Union, when this massive housing provision was realized. And also it is interesting that it was the same class of white collar workers or I don't know, like humanitarian intelligentsia, or people who were working in the humanitarian kind of sectors, who started criticizing also this methods of the building of this housing. And roughly from the mid 70s, we had a strong anti-modernist movement. It was quite all-encompassing. Like, for example, in the film, for example, it was called Sljokimpara, where the main ye- yes, when the main protagonist just got drunk and changes the city, like he thinks that he's in Moscow, but he's in Leningrad, and he uh, misses the house and the apartment, and everything is the same. So the main criticism was that this new microraions and new districts and new architecture was alienating, like socially degrading, and so on. And they started to think about new architecture, and they started romanticization of the city center. They called it like urbanists and architects, Soviet Georgian urbanists and architects, like city center of Tbilisi was the main kind of main symbol of social architecture, or socially kind of interactive architecture. They started even one of the first renovation projects of the old city. And there is a one interview with the famous Georgian architect Shotak Avlashvili, which states that working on the old town, on the rehabilitation of old town, it is exercise for the architects to take the knowledge in the outskirts of the city, in the peripheries of the city. And this was also, of course, not like an original idea. It was a uh, postmodernist kind of idea of architecture, which was also very popular in the West as well. But the difference between the Western postmodern architecture and, for example, Soviet postmodernist architecture was that the economic base, even though the private property and private wealth was proliferating here in Soviet Union in this period, especially in Georgia. But the base of the postmodernist culture was totally different in the Soviet planned economy, and in the Western economies of the 70s, where this stagflation and everything, and what was the base of this postmodern culture. So, I mean, Soviet postmodernist architecture was also the part of this culture, and it's also interesting in this respect. I think that it was praised by the elites here, by the middle class and the elites, and the real basis, or economic basis, was totally different from the countries of origin of this culture. This is a building from the late 80s, and in this housing building we can already see that the architecture is totally different. It's kind of trying to adapt to the existing city fabric, to recall to history, to become more like context responsive, etc. So for example, this round balconies, the shape of the building itself, the shape of the roof, it's a kind of attempt to go back to the history, and go back to the historical layout of the street and of this area. On the peripheries, the building process continues. The massive industrialized building process continues until the very end of the Soviet Union. But in the city center, this kind of experimental things are done. And as I see now, it was kind of like a dissident kind of practice, because not in all architecture studios we are allowed this kind of things. For example, especially like working on the historic district in the center, like in the historic center of the city, and somehow it became the like dissident. Ideologically, it was kind of a dissident practice of architecture. Another one is from Gori. They went to this kind of like more local building materials, not industrial, not directly this kind of um, ready-made, industrially made elements, but locally kind of built made materials and built structures. There are some kind of research and ideas that make parallel to the Stalinism and postmodernist architecture. So they call it like, so there are some authors who call Stalinist like postmodernist, and there are some who call this postmodernist architecture as new Stalinism. But clearly they have some kind of similarities in the kind of architectural or building approaches, but I still think that the similarity is quite superficial because the aims of the Stalinist architecture was quite different, you know, and aims of this um, buildings were also, or this ideology was also quite different. Even though this kind of parallel can be done, and it's interesting to kind of research this kind of parallels, I think. So this criticism of massively built areas and districts and also architecture, one of the manifestations of this criticism was that they thought that these buildings needed some kind of beautification or renovation in a way that they regain some kind of cultural significance. So there were some projects like competitions, student projects, some kind of experimental ideas in which we are experimenting with the additions to the existing massively produced buildings. Additions were also kind of political statement or ideological statement against these massively produced buildings. And they were also elaborated in academias, in architects who were thinking about it. So I think it was not only for the shortage of the space, but also this kind of beautification or kind of culturalization of this massively produced buildings, which were under the harsh criticism in this period. And now this ideology also of course continues today, and these buildings are received by the middle class or by the elite very negatively.
What happens to all the public housing and architecture after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everything was privatized, first of all. While in other republics, for example, in Russia, also in Belarus, the state regained the ownership of the housing stock, not regained but maintained. Here, everything was privatized, and also this had influence in the 90s on the physical condition of the buildings because they were not maintained anymore. So many of them became degraded because of this massive privatization. Also, these additions continued also after the Soviet Union, and they became already wild, not really planned and and engineered or planned proper way. I also have one slide with this kind of wild addition, which is, yeah, for example, this one, or there is another one which is like a small Hrushevka, and it became like from all sides it is covered with the additions, and from top. This is what happened, and now today, for example, the fate of Hrushevkas is kind of under question because the municipality, for example, in this area where I mentioned in Marketili, they are physically already degraded. Some of the buildings they started changing this building with the new ones, but also developers see them as a profitable investment areas because Khrushchevkas are built on the large land plots with a huge empty spaces, huge like greenery and everything. As developers see them as a good investment possibility to build much higher buildings with a higher density, and the municipality views it as a social project to change the existing housing stock. So I think in the future, this will be the main kind of trend in these areas of changing the low density of low story, four-story Khrushchevkas on the first place because it's more like rent. They see it as a more like a lucrative kind of business than, for example, like nine-story buildings or some others.
Can you also talk about some of the qualifications or some of the things that they looked for when they built housing? Because as I understand it, they took considerations for like enough sunlight, a certain quality of air, not to have it this is too high, that it might be more alienating, and so on. So, do you remember some of the criteria that they try to put in
Yes.
that make it more friendly to humans?
Yes, of course. I mean, there were all Soviet-wide standards of insulation, of ionization, or how it's called in English. Like, for example, crosswind should go to in all apartments and this kind of things. And the standards for each kind of function, like a bedroom, like a living room, everything. Uh, Standards um, for the planning area, like with greenery and population ratio, standards to the amenities like I don't know, schools and everything like this, or shops, even the distance to the working place. And this was all standardized, and of course, this was all higher quality than today. We have this deregulated situation, and in the high class buildings, of course, we have good apartments and everything. But what is building massively today? It's these buildings are much worse quality than the Soviet housing buildings in the perspective of planning, in perspective of building materials, in perspective of, I don't know, engineering and everything, um, because they are just new and they are already dilapidated, and the Soviet housing blocks are already standing, I don't know, 60 years or something. So. Yeah, in this case, in this perspective, the situation is quite difficult today.
Because we are a mountainous country, do we have a lot of materials, or do we have a lot of materials that already are ready to use? Or how did that play? Does that play a role at all? Or how do we import most of the stuff, even during Soviet Union, did it come from other countries, the materials, or did we have it locally?
Of course, Soviet building production was involved in this Soviet-wide chain or supply and production chain, and it depended on the materials. For example, the wood was imported from Russia, of course, like especially wood for the building. While, for example, wood for furniture maybe was supplied from here to the rest, but exclusively for building, it was from Russia. While other materials like concrete or bricks and everything was made locally, and And the main emphasis was on the industrialization of building process, like on elaborating techniques of uh, fast and economical and accordingly possibly qualitative buildings. And they achieved it very successfully, I think. And one of the things about the mountainous region was that there was a seismic standards also. There were seismic zoning of Georgia. For example, Tbilisi in the 9 bar seismic zone, and everything what was built in the counting on this zoning seismic standards.
Yeah, now there's tons of buildings right on the mountains that could fall down, that could be completely
Yes,
in the event of an earthquake.
yes. I mean, this is kind of like a building standards was much higher in Soviet period than today. Uh, in terms of everything, like in terms of like urban planning, in terms of building, in terms of planning of the individual buildings or apartments, it's not comparable actually to the situation.
Even like liberals who like hate the Soviet Union will often use like Soviet standards to fight against the development now.
Yes,
I've noticed a lot where they'll say, but look, like you can't do this because it's sexually bad for, whatever. And they'll
yes,
usually use,
yes,
even though
yes,
they hate the Soviet Union,
yes,
but they
yes,
will
yes.
always use.
Yes, I think it's a paradox that I showed, like regarding this massively produced buildings, that in a way the people who were not nurtured in these buildings and who were settled there and who were raised, and this was a main their kind of class lift uh, housing, they turned against these buildings so radically, and they started criticizing these buildings and hating these buildings. So, in a way, like metaphorically speaking, this architecture destroyed itself in a way, you know. But yeah, it's a historical process, so we'll see like how it develops.
One of the strangest things when I first moved back to Georgia, and also a lot of foreigners will say, is because of this privatization and no one actually owned the building, actually taking care of the building, and all the costs associated with it, is the elevators with the coin machines to put in to go
Yes,
up. Now,
yes,
which when I first saw it, I thought this was the craziest, most, I don't know, libertarian kind of thing I've ever seen.
yes, yes.
Um, but I think it's mostly being phased out. I think there's still buildings with it, but I find that like the fact that there was such a lack of coordination, they couldn't even figure out how to get like funding from the entire neighborhoods to be able to fund a elevator to work without implementing the system of putting money in every time you want to use it.
Sure. So today, this kind of elevators we meet in the Soviet buildings mainly, but like newly built buildings already they are exclusive, you know. So in a way, like strangers already cannot get inside. So probably the elevator is free of charge, but it's the exclusion starts on the front door of the building, you know, somehow. So it kind of changed the place.
Like my building is new. They will disconnect my card and I will not be able to go use the elevator if I don't pay every
Yes,
month.
yes. So it became more corporate organization, you know, somehow.
Levan, you mentioned the aspect of housing, which is like obviously critical to understanding it, is the fact that Soviet housing was only possible as it existed because of socialist planning.
Yes,
Yeah. And you talk about how in the socialist and planned economy, that produced a certain type of housing. But my question is that how did the sort of like zoning of new neighborhoods like Sabortalo, for example, factor into this local way that planning took place. What I mean is that obviously you have Soviet-wide housing plans,
Yes.
and then you have the local needs of the planning that take place, right? And we've talked about some of the local specifics about the architecture, about, the environmental concerns. But I guess I'm curious, like, how the Soviet Georgian housing planning operations happened when they were building entirely new neighborhoods like Sabortalo, because my understanding of Sabortalo is that this is like the quintessential sort of Soviet neighborhood in the post-war era.
Yes.
And so if you have anything you could say about that, that would be interesting to me.
Mhm. Yes, the planning was also totally different from the capitalist societies because the concept of zoning was not really the same, or maybe it was just absent in the Soviet planning system because uh, what they did, how they approached it, is that first of all, the land resources were, of course, state, and the the first step was the study of the land resources for the new neighborhoods and the feasibility studies. How it could develop to identification of the areas, and then it was more projecting, more planning than, for example, zoning and providing to the different kind of builders. It was state institutions who were planning physically these neighborhoods with concrete kind of like masses of the buildings, of the um, patterns of the streets or circulation or the of course the counting the population, the needs of this population, and planning the appropriate functions in the areas. And I have one of the slides which shows this planning model of the Gldani district, which was made exactly this way, that the land area was identified, and then the state project institution, worked on the planning of this neighborhood, of this area, of the district, with many several microraions inside.
Do you know anything about the process of like new apartment allocation? So like how, I mean, obviously there's these buildings that were, and we've discussed them, where a certain profession or a certain industry had buildings that were, or a certain aspect of the party elite or workers from a specific factory were getting these buildings built. But in general, in sort of the late Soviet period, when you have
Yeah.
Gildani being built, or you have these new regions, new neighborhoods being built. How were apartments allocated to
Mhm.
whom? Do you know anything about that process?
Yes, there was two main kind of lines of this allocation. The one was that organizations with their budgets, they're building housing blocks for their employees. Different organizations, I don't know, universities, for example, these planning institutions themselves, uh, many different organizations. And there were some queues, and the queues were made. You could apply to the new house to get the housing based on the working years, how many years you have, which is how many years you had working experience, and the living conditions. If the employee had a bad housing, family in the overcrowded housing, or like degraded housing, they could apply, and these queues were made in this way. Uh, and another one was which was called cooperatives. And the cooperatives was the thing that uh, also employees, for example, who were not in this list of organizations for some reasons, they organized themselves. They made cooperatives. State or city provided with the land, and they could take the projects, different projects which were ready in the institutions. So they needed some small kind of adaptations to the area, and then this cooperative could build the apartment block. And this was more kind of like a not private but out of organization collective initiative. So this was the two main roads to get the apartment in this period. In the late Soviet period and after the Soviet periods, a lot of cooperatives were damaged because of these economic problems and everything. And even today, there are some cooperatives who are waiting uh, to their buildings to be finished because municipality gave these unfinished buildings, or some maybe someone had some land reserved for this building and they could not start building, and municipality gave this lands or unfinished buildings to the private developers. They allowed them to build more, for example, because of this reason. And then these private developers built and are still building this kind of houses, and then allocating portions of this housing stock to this members of these cooperatives who were damaged in the 90s.
Yeah, these cooperative housing projects, especially in the late Soviet Union, I've read a little bit about and heard about from participants. I remember meeting this doctor in Tbilisi who she was telling me how that her and her husband were part of this cooperative housing apartment building in, I believe in Saburtalo somewhere. And it was about all of them pooling money and becoming basically resident owners of these new apartments. But this was in the 80s. Did any of the late Gorbachev reforms in the Soviet period, late Soviet period prior to the collapse of the USSR, how did they begin to affect either housing projects, buildings for housing, apartment allocation? Did you start to see sort of any change? I mean, you mentioned earlier this interesting part about the bourgeois liberal ideology kind of germinating in these apartment buildings, which I think is of the Soviet middle class. But I'm also curious if like new building projects were affected by late Gorbachev era reforms prior to the
Uh,
collapse.
I don't have a clear answer to this because I don't know I mean exactly this kind of thing, but for example, architecturally, it had the influence because architecture also changed. No, what I show, for example, with our examples, but on the policy level or this allocation level, uh, I'm not sure actually because as I know, this cooperative houses initiatives existed before Gorbachev period.
Maybe this is a question outside the scope of the discussion, but I do also know that, in the 70s, and there was corruption, of course, in the Soviet system everywhere. But in Georgia, I know that, and especially in Abkhazia, you had lots of these so-called ruble millionaires who were able to siphon funds from their position inside of their collectives or inside of the factories, or they had access to certain goods that they could make money off of. And I have read that some of these people were building illegal houses or building mansions or kind of like big pieces of property to live in this period. So do you have anything, maybe insight, knowledge about illegal housing in Soviet Georgia and who was doing it, where it was, and why it happened?
Like in general, what was built here in Georgia, it was much bigger scale, or like more um, uh, comfortable or more kind of lavish than in other republics, Soviet republics. For example, I remember my mother's story that she had a course mate from Leningrad, from St. Petersburg, visited here, and she was amazed by their house in Tel Aviv. It was just like a normal house in Tel Aviv. It's like a normal, everyone more or less same house. But for her course mate, it was very surprising to see this kind of house. She was from Pskov, from northern Russia. So of course, it was this kind of difference between here and rest of the Soviet republics. But specifically about illegal, basically this kind of things were illegal. No, like probably it was like illegal to have one private house, but the second was already illegal. So they somehow probably this can be case that somehow whoever managed to build a second house, it would be already illegal. Not regarding it was like this kind of big one and with rich housing or just like small house. The second one already was illegal.
Yeah, this thing about visitors coming to Georgia, sorry, the visitors coming to Georgia and seeing how much better people were living from other parts of the Soviet Union in terms of like room, in terms of the size of the ceilings, in terms of the even some of the apartments
Yes.
having similar plans, for example, to the ones that you would see in Leningrad or Moscow, but the balconies being larger, the ceilings being higher. I mean, this is quite interesting part of the Georgian Soviet experience.
Yes, yes. Yeah, first of all, the history of Soviet housing, very interesting topic, I think, and it needs more research and more appreciation also uh, of this part of our history, and also more appreciation to the artifacts of this history. And I think also it's much there are many things to learn from it. For example, now I teach in the Technical University's Faculty of Architecture, and one of the ideas is to start experimenting with the students this kind of factory-made architecture or massive production of architecture, and how can what we can learn from it, how can we develop or extend it, uh, and this kind of issues. And then there are many more kind of areas of study that something we can learn from it. And also on the policy level, I think it's to look at it, and on the political level as well, uh, as we have this history and uh, during this process of our historical process that people are getting more and more aware of their past, and more and more kind of reappreciating today's situation and going out of euphoria of the 90s and of this post-Soviet kind of Cold War thinking. Now, I think it will become more and more actual and more important to get back to this history, and to learn and to politicize also these kind of questions in the future.
I look forward to also more studies based on this because it's such an incredibly important topic, especially because we also have a housing crisis in the sense that there's tons of buildings being built and then people still are not able to buy homes. And also the building qualities are quite bad. The way they are being built, and also the traffic congestion on top of it, not having things besides pharmacies and markets, right? That seems to be the only priority of new buildings, is to just get pharmacies and anywhere to buy more stuff.
No, that Sopo mentioned these pharmacies and these standard things that we meet on the each square, and the Stalin period buildings are were desired for the banks actually because they are like most like a uh, uh, like most comfortable and most showing off buildings.
The process of capitalist ventures or capitalist businesses, capitalist interests repurposing Soviet buildings is super interesting. So the fact that the banks with interest in the Stalin era buildings for certain reasons. If you have any comments, I mean, how you see this process specifically in Georgia manifesting not only today, but through the post-Soviet period of specific capitalist interests wanting or desiring or capitalizing on.
Yes, of course, it's very interesting also area of aspect of this history and uh, yeah, in recent years, this capitalist class or capital they started kind of entering in this field uh, and kind of reappreciating the Soviet um, built heritage. And yeah, we have these examples of uh, banks, what I mentioned, which are going very often to the Stalinist buildings, um, and also this building of the famous building of the Ministry of Highways, which was bought by the Bank of Georgia, and which is kind of different architecture. It's like a modernist architecture, and they capitalized on it very successfully. And also another aspect is the um Ajara group, which is also trying to get into this segment, and they are like trying to revitalize industrial buildings and other Soviet buildings, and they are also, of course, profiting on it, and yeah, the funny thing is that um, they create this kind of image of kind of squatted buildings, squatted industrial buildings. For example, we have the building named this factory on this left bank of the left side of the river in Tbilisi, and yeah, if you look at on the first sight, you think it's like some squatted building by some artists, like you have in the Western Europe, and they are kind of getting the spaces very cheaply or maybe free and kind of working there and everything like this. And suddenly it becomes that it's like a very expensive private kind of development, this kind of disguise. Or we have another example in the Radio City, so-called Radio City in Mukhiani, which was like a radio factory, and now it's like this kind of co-working, some kind of space, and many such examples. So yeah, they have this kind of specific strategies, how to enter this field. For example, TBC Bank, they have this kind of artistic kind of network, funding some architecture biennales, making exhibitions there. Also, they purchased like quite some time ago this uh, TETS building, which is like also industrial building, but from the earlier period from 20s. And yeah, it's like very successful. And I think with time it will become more and more kind of like a successful and lucrative kind of affair, to making this kind of products and images out of this Soviet kind of souvenirs, like.
pšenic vinda si na fer. Zatakli na fer, zatakli na fer. Maraci bliz vode pšenic vinda si na fer.